The geologist was standing in a parking garage in downtown Seattle when she understood what she was looking at. She had been there dozens of times before, had walked past this particular wall on the lower level of the structure, without giving it a second glance. The way you walk past things, in a city that are so familiar, they become invisible. But on this afternoon, in the autumn of 2024, she had stopped. Something in the concrete, in the precise way a crack ran diagonally through the foundation wall and then changed direction slightly before continuing downward, had caught her attention in a way she could not immediately explain. She crouched down and looked more closely. She ran her fingers along the edge of the crack. She took out her phone and photographed it from 3 different angles. Then she stood up and looked at the wall for a long time. And when she described this moment later to colleagues, she said that the feeling was not one of alarm, not immediately, but of recognition. The crack was telling her something. The question was whether she was reading it correctly. She drove back to her office at the University of Washington and pulled up the subsurface mapping data that her team had been refining for the past 2 years. She looked at the cracked photographs again. She looked at the data again. And then she made a phone call that set in motion a chain of conversations and analyses. And eventually a research paper that is now forcing the scientific community that studies earthquake hazard in the Pacific Northwest to confront a possibility that many of them had considered, but that none of them had wanted to be the first to say out loud. The Seattle fault is not new. Geologists have known about it since the 1990s, when a series of studies using marine seismic reflection data began to reveal the outlines of a fault system running east-west across the southern edge of the Seattle metropolitan area. What those studies described was already alarming enough to be taken seriously by emergency managers and urban planners. A fault running directly beneath a major American city, capable of producing earthquakes with magnitudes in the range of 7 to 7.5, with the potential to generate a local tsunami in Puget Sound, was not a piece of information that could be easily dismissed or relegated to the background of planning assumptions. Seattle spent the subsequent decades incorporating the Seattle fault into its seismic hazard assessments, its building codes, its emergency response planning, and its public communication about earthquake risk. The fault was known. The hazard was acknowledged. A body of preparedness infrastructure was built around a set of assumptions about what the Seattle fault could do. The new research is changing those assumptions. Not all of them, and not in a direction that makes the picture simpler. It is changing them in the direction that earthquake science has moved so many times in the history of the discipline. The direction of greater complexity, greater potential for outcomes that the previous understanding had underestimated. The scientists who have spent the past several years refining the picture of the Seattle fault using new data sources, new analytical techniques, and a willingness to look at what the evidence actually says, rather than what existing models predict, are arriving at conclusions that are making their colleagues uncomfortable in the specific and productive way that good science makes people uncomfortable. The fault is longer than previously mapped. Its connection to other fault systems in the region is more intimate and more mechanically significant than anyone had established. And the earthquake that the Seattle fault is capable of producing, the one that Seattle has been preparing for as its defining seismic threat, may be a fundamentally different kind of event than the planning assumptions have described. This is the story of what the new research found, what it means, and why it is forcing a city of nearly 4 million people to reckon with the earthquake hazard beneath its streets in a way that is more urgent and more complicated than anything it has faced before. To understand why the new findings matter, you need to understand what was previously believed about the Seattle fault and why that belief was considered settled enough to serve as the basis for decades of planning and preparation. The fault system that geologists identified in the 1990s was described, in the language of structural geology, as a thrust fault zone. A thrust fault is a type of fault in which one block of crust is pushed up and over another under compressional stress. The visual image that helps most people understand this is to imagine taking 2 books and pushing them together horizontally. The edges buckle upward, where they meet, one book riding up over the other. The Seattle fault is a zone where the crust of the Pacific Northwest is being compressed, pushed from the south by the continued northward movement of tectonic forces associated with the broader convergence of the Juan-de-Fuca plate beneath the North American plate. This compression has built up over millions of years and has produced a zone of thrust faulting that runs east-west beneath the southern part of the Seattle metropolitan area, beneath Puget Sound, beneath the communities of Renton and Bellevue and Mercer Island, and West Seattle, beneath the infrastructure that serves one of the most economically significant metropolitan areas in the United States. The original mapping of the Seattle fault zone placed its primary surface trace, the line along which the fault's movement would most directly affect the ground surface, somewhere in the vicinity of the South Seattle neighborhoods that border the Duwamish River Valley. This placement was based on the best available data at the time, primarily the marine seismic reflection surveys conducted in Puget Sound that could image the fault structure beneath the water, but had more limited resolution beneath the land surface. and on the geological field, evidence of past surface rupture that had been documented in scattered locations across the southern part of the city. The geological evidence for past rupture on the Seattle Fault was itself significant and should not be Research published in the late 1990s and early 2000s documented the occurrence of a major earthquake on the Seattle Fault approximately 1100 years ago, an event that was associated with massive landslides along the shores of Puget Sound, the sudden uplift of land surfaces along the fault's trace, and a tsunami that propagated across Puget Sound and deposited sand layers in coastal marshes that geologists can identify and date in cores taken from those environments. This was not a theoretical earthquake. It was a documented geological event, preserved in the rock and sediment record of the region, datable to within a few decades of a specific moment in the past. The Seattle Fault had moved. The Seattle Fault had produced a catastrophic earthquake. The Seattle Fault would move again. What was uncertain, and what remained uncertain for the subsequent 2 decades of research, was the precise geometry of the faulted depth, the extent of its connections to neighboring fault systems, and the full range of its ability to generate multiple simultaneous or rapidly sequential ruptures across different segments of what turned out to be a more complex structural zone than the initial mapping had suggested. The new research is resolving several of these uncertainties, and the resolution is not moving in a reassuring direction. The dataset that changed everything was not gathered by a single research team using a single method. It was assembled from multiple sources over several years, in the way that scientific understanding usually advances, through the accumulation and integration of observations that individually might have seemed ambiguous or incomplete, but that collectively began to tell a coherent and disturbing story. The first major contribution came from the LiDAR surveys that had been conducted across the greater Seattle metropolitan area over the previous decade. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, is a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to build extraordinarily detailed 3-dimensional maps of the ground surface. The power of LiDAR for fault mapping comes from its ability to strip away the visual clutter of vegetation and urban development that makes fault features difficult to see on the ground or in conventional aerial photography. When a LiDAR survey processes its data, it reveals the bare topography beneath everything that covers it. The subtle ridges and scarps and offset drainages that record the history of fault movement in the landscape, in the actively forested and densely developed terrain of the Seattle region. This capability is particularly valuable because the combination of dense vegetation and continuous urban development makes it nearly impossible to trace fault features across the landscape using conventional observation methods. The LiDAR analysis that the research team applied to the existing dataset revealed fault-related topographic features in locations that the previous mapping had not identified as fault tracing. Some of these features were subtle, small scarps and slight ridges that in isolation might have been dismissed as erosional features or artifacts of development grading. But when mapped collectively and compared to the known geometry of the Seattle Fault zone at depth, they formed a pattern that was geometrically consistent with a fault system that extended further to the east and further to the west than the previous mapping had shown, and that had subsidiary fault strands and orientations that suggested a more structurally complex zone than the earlier model of a single primary fault with a few subsidiary strands had described. The second major contribution came from a new generation of subsurface imaging conducted using a technique called seismic reflection profiling on land, which is distinct from the marine seismic reflection surveys that had provided the foundational data for the Seattle Fault's initial characterization. Land-based seismic reflection surveys are logistically challenging and expensive, and they had not been conducted across the Seattle area at the resolution and coverage needed to fully image the fault structure at depth beneath the dense urban terrain. The surveys that were completed between 2021 and 2023, using a combination of controlled explosive sources and large mechanical vibration sources, mounted on specially equipped trucks, produced images of the subsurface that extended the fault's known geometry downward and laterally in ways that substantially revised the previous picture. The fault at depth was not a single clean structure cutting through relatively homogeneous crust. It was a zone of multiple steeply dipping and more gently dipping fault surfaces that intersected and merged and split in a 3-dimensional geometry that had not been previously resolved. The third contribution, and in many ways the most significant for understanding the fault's potential behavior in a future earthquake, came from the compilation and reanalysis of the paleoseismic record. Paleoseismology is the branch of geology that reconstructs the history of past earthquakes from the physical evidence they leave in the landscape and in the sedimentary record. The techniques include trenching across fault scarps to expose and date the sediment sequences that record individual rupture events, analyzing the characteristics of tsunami deposits and coastal sediments to reconstruct the size and frequency of past tsunamis and examining the tree ring and radiocarbon records preserved in trees that were killed or uplifted during past earthquakes. The paleoseismic record for the Seattle fault that had been assembled before the new research was already rich enough to establish that the fault had produced major earthquakes in the past. The new analysis of additional trench sites, combined with higher resolution dating methods and a more systematic comparison of evidence from sites across the full extent of the fault zone, produced a revised picture of the past earthquake history that was more complex and more alarming than what had been previously understood. The specific findings of the new research, as presented in the papers that began appearing in the scientific literature in late 2024 and through 2025, can be organized around three central conclusions that each individually would have been significant, and that together represent a fundamental revision of the Seattle fault hazard picture. The first conclusion is that the fault is longer than previously mapped. The pre-existing characterization of the Seattle fault placed its western terminus somewhere in the vicinity of the southern end of Puget Sound near the Kitsap Peninsula, and its eastern terminus in the vicinity of the Cascade foothills east of the Seattle metropolitan area. The new mapping, integrating the LiDAR topographic evidence with the new subsurface imaging data, and with the reanalysis of historical seismic data, extends the fault's mapped length significantly in both directions. To the west, fault-related features are now documented, extending across the Kitsap Peninsula and into the Hood Canal region, a distance roughly 50% greater than the previous western terminus. To the east, the fault's connection to structures in the Cascade foothills is clearer and more extensive than previously mapped, with fault-related deformation visible in the landscape at elevations and distances from the metropolitan core that earlier surveys had not characterized as part of the Seattle fault zone. The significance of fault length is not merely cartographic. In the physics of earthquake mechanics, fault length is one of the most important parameters that determines the maximum earthquake a fault system can produce. The relationship between fault length and maximum earthquake magnitude is not linear. It is logarithmic, which means that relatively modest increases in mapped fault length can translate into substantially larger potential earthquake magnitudes. The specific magnitude estimates that emerge from applying standard fault length and magnitude relationships to the newly extended fault mapping are what are driving the most significant revisions to the hazard assessment. A fault of the length that had been previously mapped could produce a maximum earthquake in the range of magnitude 7 to 7.5. A fault of the length that the new mapping suggests is possibly introduces upper end scenarios that approach magnitude 7.5 to 8, and in some configurations of the fault system that the new data permits, potentially higher. The second conclusion is that the Seattle fault is more intimately connected to the broader regional fault network than previous models had established. The Pacific Northwest is a seismically complex region. The dominant seismic hazard that most people in Seattle and the surrounding region have been educated about is not the Seattle fault at all. It is the Cascadia subduction zone, the vast offshore megathrust fault where the Honde Fuca plate is diving beneath the North American plate and where geological evidence documents a history of magnitude 9 and greater earthquakes occurring at intervals of several centuries to several hundred years. The most recent full rupture, Cascadia earthquake, which occurred in January of 1700 and produced a tsunami that crossed the Pacific to Japan and was recorded in Japanese historical documents, is the defining context for earthquake preparedness in the Pacific Northwest. The phrase, the big one, when used in Seattle, traditionally refers to a full or near full rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone. What the new research is establishing is that the relationship between the Seattle fault and the Cascadia subduction zone, and between the Seattle fault and the other crustal faults that make up the regional fault network in the Puget Sound region, is more mechanically significant than previously understood. The Seattle fault is not an isolated structure operating independently of the broader tectonic stress field. It is a component of a connected system, and the connections have implications for how the fault might behave in the context of a larger regional seismic event, and for how a Seattle fault earthquake might affect the loading state of neighboring structures. The specific evidence for these connections comes from multiple sources. The new subsurface imaging shows structural continuity between the Seattle fault zone and fault structures that extend northward toward the South Whidbey Island fault system that runs beneath the northern part of the Seattle metropolitan area and whose hazard has been considered separately from the Seattle fault in previous assessments. The LiDAR mapping shows topographic signatures consistent with fault-related deformation in the zone between the Seattle fault and structures to the north, suggesting that what has been mapped as a gap between separate fault systems may actually be a zone of more distributed deformation connecting them. And the paleoseismic record shows patterns of past earthquake timing that are difficult to explain if the regional faults are operating independently, but that become more coherent if the faults are mechanically interacting with stress changes caused by rupture on one fault, influencing the loading state of neighboring faults in ways that promote subsequent ruptures. The third conclusion, and the one that has generated the most discussion in the scientific community and the most concern among emergency managers, is that the paleoseismic record contains evidence of multi-segment ruptures. The previous model of Seattle fault earthquakes described them as single-segment events, in which one portion of the fault system would rupture in a single earthquake, producing a large but geographically limited ground motion pattern centered on the rupture zone. Multi-segment ruptures are different. They occur when two or more adjacent segments of a fault system, or even two structurally connected but previously considered separate faults, rupture simultaneously, or in such rapid succession that they effectively function as a single large earthquake. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, which reached magnitude 9 and caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster, was a multi-segment rupture. The 2010 Haiti earthquake, which killed more than 200,000 people, was associated with rupture on multiple fault segments. The history of earthquake science is filled with examples of faults that were considered separate structures until an actual earthquake demonstrated their mechanical connection by rupturing them together. The relationship between earthquake magnitude and damage is not intuitive, because the magnitude scale is low. An earthquake of magnitude 7.5 releases approximately 5.5 times more energy than a magnitude 7 earthquake. The area that experiences the level of ground shaking associated with major structural damage is significantly larger for the larger event, and the peak ground motions in the near-fault zone, the region within tens of kilometers of the fault surface where the ground shaking is most intense, scale upward with magnitude in ways that mean structures designed to survive a magnitude 7 event may not be adequate for a magnitude 7.5 event, even if they meet current code requirements. Seattle is a city built on a complex and highly variable subsurface geology. The neighborhoods that sit on the deep basin of glacially deposited sediments that underlies much of the city center, the Delmish Valley, the tide flats areas, the filled ground areas along the waterfront, are far more susceptible to amplified ground shaking than the neighborhoods built on the bedrock ridges that characterize the higher elevation parts of the city. The physics of seismic wave amplification in soft sediments, which causes the ground to shake more strongly and for longer durations in basin environments than the same wave would produce on bedrock, has been known and incorporated into seismic hazard assessments for decades. What the new magnitude estimates from the Seattle fault research are doing is raising the level of input shaken that these amplification effects will be applied to, which raises the predicted ground motions in the most vulnerable parts of the city to levels that are higher than the current building code assumptions in many cases. The conversation that has been happening among structural engineers in Seattle since the new research findings began to circulate is one that the profession has a long and imperfect history of navigating. Structural engineers are trained to design buildings that will perform adequately under the design ground motions specified by the building code. And the building code is a document that represents a codified consensus about what level of hazard buildings need to be designed for and what level of performance is required under that hazard. The code evolves as the science evolves, incorporating new hazard data when that data has been validated and accepted through the appropriate technical review processes. But the code evolution is always lagging behind the science. Necessity. Because the process of incorporating new science into a legally binding design standard involves review cycles and consensus processes and economic impact assessments that take years. The specific question that Seattle's structural engineering community is working through is whether the current building code, which was calibrated to the previous understanding of Seattle fault hazard, remains adequate in light of the new findings, and if it does not, what needs to change. This is not a simple question. The building code applies to new construction. The existing building stock, the hundreds of thousands of buildings that were designed and constructed under previous codes, is not subject to the revised requirements except through voluntary or mandated retrofit programs. The existing building stock in Seattle includes a substantial number of structures that were built before the Seattle fault was identified as a significant hazard, before modern seismic design provisions were incorporated into the code, and before the connection between soft sediment amplification and building damage was as well understood as it is today. These buildings are a fixed point in the landscape. They will be there when the Seattle fault next ruptures. The question is how well they will perform. The unreinforced masonry buildings that remain in Seattle's older neighborhoods and commercial districts are the structures most frequently identified in seismic vulnerability assessments as height. Unreinforced masonry, which is brick or concrete block construction without the steel reinforcement that ties the wall elements together, provides ductility under seismic loading, behaves poorly in earthquakes. The walls crack and then disintegrate, the roof and floor systems lose their support, and the building collapses in ways that leave very little safe space for occupancy. Seattle has been running a voluntary unreinforced masonry retrofit program for years, and progress has been made. But the program is voluntary, and the number of buildings that have been retrofitted remains a small fraction of those that were identified as needing attention. The new research findings, by raising the potential intensity of a Seattle fault earthquake, increase the urgency of completing this work. The soft story would frame buildings that make up a significant portion of Seattle's residential rental housing. Stock present a different but equally serious vulnerability. These are typically 2 to 4-story buildings with retail or parking on the ground floor, providing a relatively open and flexible first story that is structurally weaker than the stories above it. Under strong seismic loading, the soft story deforms disproportionately, absorbing damage that compromises the building's overall stability. These buildings have been the source of significant casualties in past earthquakes in other cities with similar building stock. Seattle has been working on mandatory soft story retrofit requirements, and progress has been made in implementing them. But the timeline for completion extends 4 years, and the new hazard estimates are raising questions about whether the design standards for the retrofits are calibrated to the right level of hazard. The bridge and highway infrastructure that serves the Seattle metropolitan area represents another dimension of the vulnerability picture that the new research is complicating. Many of the major bridges in the Seattle area, including structures that serve as critical corridors for emergency response and that carry lifeline infrastructure, including water mains and gas lines, were designed under older seismic provisions that did not account for the full extent of the Seattle fault hazard as it is now understood. The Washington State Department of Transportation has been conducting seismic vulnerability assessments and prioritizing retrofit projects for the highest risk structures. But the inventory of structures needing attention is large, and the resources for retrofit are limited. A Seattle fault earthquake in the upper range of what the new research suggests is possible would impose demands on these structures that exceed their design basis, in many cases. The tsunami question is one that the new research has also addressed, and the findings are among the most significant for the specific populations and infrastructure that are concentrated along the shores of Puget Sound. The 1100-year-old Seattle fault earthquake was associated with a tsunami that reached heights of several meters along the shores of Puget Sound, based on the geological evidence from tsunami deposits in coastal sediments. This documented past event has been the primary basis for Puget Sound tsunami hazard modeling related to the Seattle fault. The new research does not change the fundamental fact of that past event, but it does change the context in which that event is understood. If the Seattle fault is longer than previously mapped, and if multi-segment ruptures are within the range of possible behaviors, Then the fault displacement that would accompany a major earthquake, particularly one involving simultaneous rupture of multiple segments, could be larger than was used in previous tsunami generation models. Larger fault displacement translates to larger initial sea surface deformation, which translates to larger tsunami wave heights. The tsunami modeling that has been conducted using the new fault parameters suggests that wave heights in some areas of Puget Sound could be meaningfully higher than what the previous models had projected, affecting communities and infrastructure that were cited on the basis of the earlier hazard assessments. Puget Sound is a confined water body, roughly 100 miles long, and in most places between 3 and 15 miles wide, bounded on the north by the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This geometry has specific implications for how a locally generated tsunami propagates. Unlike a tsunami generated in the open ocean, which spreads outward in all directions and diminishes in height, as a tsunami in a confined body like Puget Sound bounces and reflects off the shorelines and bathymetric features of the basin, creating a complex pattern of wave arrival that can sustain dangerous conditions in some locations for much longer than a simple single-wave model would suggest. The low-lying areas along the shores of Puget Sound that host ferry port facilities, waterfront parks and development, and in some cases critical infrastructure, including wastewater treatment plants and fuel storage facilities, are the places where this hazard is most directly relevant, and they are the places that the tsunami modeling based on the new fault parameters is suggesting need to be real. This specific concern about infrastructure is not abstract. The wastewater treatment infrastructure of the Seattle metropolitan area includes large treatment facilities that are located along the shores of Puget Sound and on the shores of other water bodies in the region. These facilities were sited and designed with consideration for seismic hazard, but the design basis in many cases reflects the hazard as understood before the new research. If those facilities are damaged or destroyed in a Seattle fault earthquake, the consequences extend well beyond the inconvenience of disrupted service. They include the release of raw or partially treated sewage into the waters of Puget Sound, with public health and environmental consequences that could persist for months. The fuel storage facilities along the waterfront, which supply aviation fuel for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and marine fuel for the vessels that serve the regional economy, are similarly critical points of vulnerability in the post-earthquake logistics picture. The conversation that all of this scientific and engineering analysis is building toward, the conversation that the new research is making it impossible to defer any longer, is the conversation about what level of investment in resilience is appropriate for a city facing a hazard that is larger and more complex than it previously understood. This conversation is difficult for reasons that have nothing to do with the science. The science is telling a relatively clear story about the hazard. The difficulty is in translating the hazard story into the investment decisions that would address it, because those decisions involve money and priorities, and the political economy of a city that has many urgent needs competing for limited resources. The cost of making Seattle's existing building stock, its critical infrastructure, and its lifeline systems adequately resilient against the seismic hazard described by the new research is large. Estimates that have been circulated in the planning and engineering community, based on the inventory of vulnerable structures and infrastructure, and the cost of bringing them to an appropriate level of seismic performance, run into the tens of billions of dollars. This is not a number that any city government can produce from its own budget in a short time frame. It is a number that implies sustained state and federal investment over years or decades, supported by a policy framework that makes seismic resilience a priority, and that creates the funding mechanisms to support the work. Seattle is not starting from zero. The city has been investing in seismic resilience for decades, since the 1990 Cascadia Awareness Campaign, and accelerating after the 2001 Nisqually earthquake, which caused over $2 billion in damage in the Puget Sound region and demonstrated the real consequences of seismic vulnerability in the built environment. The building code improvements that have been implemented since then, the voluntary and increasingly mandatory retrofit programs, the infrastructure assessments and prioritization processes, the emergency response planning that has been continuously refined. All of these represent genuine and substantial investment in seismic preparedness. The new research is not suggesting that this investment was wasted. It is suggesting that the target the investment has been aimed at was somewhat smaller than the actual target, and that the work needed is correspondingly larger. The political challenge of responding to this situation is compounded by the nature of the threat itself. An earthquake is not like a hurricane or a flood, where the physical manifestation of the hazard arrives on a timescale that keeps it visible and pressing. An earthquake is silent and invisible in the years and decades between events. The fault that runs beneath Seattle does not announce its loading state. It does not send signals that deteriorate gradually and visibly, the way a bridge that is being undermined by corrosion eventually shows outward signs of its condition. It accumulates stress silently and releases it suddenly, and catastrophically. And the interval between releases is long enough that the political will to sustain investment through multiple election cycles and budget cycles and economic fluctuations is very difficult to maintain at the level the hazard demands. The history of seismic resilience investment in earthquake-prone cities around the world is a history of bursts of activity following damaging earthquakes, periods during which the political will is high and the investment flows, followed by gradual tapering as memory fades and other priorities compete. San Francisco invested heavily in retrofit programs after the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Christchurch rebuilt its understanding of its own fault system after the 2010 and 2011 earthquakes that destroyed much of its downtown. Kobe rebuilt its port infrastructure and its elevated highway networks after the 1995 earthquake that killed more than 6,000 people and demonstrated the vulnerability of infrastructure that had been considered adequately designed. In each of these cases, the investment that followed the damaging earthquake was substantial, and in each case, the earthquake provided the political shock that overcame the inertia that had previously blocked action. Seattle is being asked to invest before the earthquake on the basis of scientific findings that describe a hazard that has not yet expressed itself in the memory of the current population. This is a harder political case to make, even if it is a more rational economic choice. The geologist who stood in the parking garage and looked at the crack in the foundation wall and then drove back to her office and pulled up the subsurface mapping data did not in that moment know exactly what chain of implications her observation was going to set in motion. She was a scientist doing what scientists do, looking carefully at the world and noticing things that do not quite fit the existing explanation, and following the thread of that, noticing to see where it leads. The thread led to a research paper, and the research paper led to a series of conversations in the scientific community, and those conversations led to a revision of the fault mapping, and the hazard assessment and the probabilistic models that emergency managers and structural engineers and urban planners use when they are making decisions about how to prepare a city for an earthquake. The specific detail of the crack in the parking garage wall is important, not because the crack itself is dramatic, but because of what it represents. It represents the physical record of past fault movement, preserved in the most ordinary and overlooked piece of urban infrastructure, waiting to be read by someone who knew what they were looking at. The Seattle fault has been leaving records of its past activity throughout the landscape of the city, in the subtle scarps visible in the LiDAR data, in the tsunami deposits preserved in the coastal sediments of Puget Sound, in the offset stream channels and uplifted terraces that can be found by people who know where to look and what to look for. The new research is the scientific community getting better at reading those records, at understanding what they say about the fault's past behavior, and therefore about its future potential. What those records say, in the reading provided by the new research, is that the Seattle fault is a more capable and more connected structure than the previous generation of studies had established. It is longer. It is more structurally complex. It has produced multi-segment ruptures in the past, and it is embedded in a regional fault network that may modulate its behavior in ways that the previous single fault model did not account for. The earthquake that this fault system is capable of producing is larger than what the planning assumptions that govern Seattle's preparedness infrastructure were calibrated to. Not so much larger that the previous preparations were without value. They were not. Every building retrofitted, and every emergency plan refined, and every vulnerable population educated about what to do has made Seattle more resilient, but larger enough that the gap between the current state of preparation and the state that the hazard demands is wider than was previously understood. There is a particular way in which scientists talk about uncertainty that is often misunderstood by the broader public, and that is especially relevant to the Seattle fault research. When the scientists involved in this work say that the new findings are forcing a rethink of the hazard, they are not saying that the previous understanding was simply wrong, and that the new understanding is simply right. They are saying that the distribution of possible outcomes has shifted, that the upper end of what is physically possible is higher than previously mapped, and that the evidence for multi-segment ruptures has moved that scenario from speculative to plausible. This is the language of probability and possibility rather than certainty, and it is the honest language for describing what science can and cannot say about a geological system that operates on longer than human observation, and that preserves its history and records that are incomplete and imprecisely datable. The uncertainty is real, and it matters. The recurrence interval for major Seattle fault earthquakes remains poorly constrained. The specific configuration of faults that would rupture in the next event is not known. The precise moment of the next rupture is completely unknowable, not because the science is inadequate, but because earthquake systems are chaotic in the specific mathematical sense, meaning that their future state is exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions that cannot be measured precisely enough to permit deterministic prediction. Nobody can tell Seattle when the next earthquake will come. What the new research can tell Seattle and what it is telling Seattle clearly is what the range of possible earthquakes includes and how that range has been expanded by the new findings. This kind of probabilistic revision, in which the tails of the distribution are extended without a change in the mean, is exactly the kind of information that building codes and hazard assessments and infrastructure design standards are designed to incorporate. The process of incorporating it is not instantaneous. It involves technical review and professional consensus and code change cycles that take years. But the starting point for that process is the scientific finding, and the scientific finding has now been made. The peer-reviewed literature has the new fault mapping, the revised magnitude estimates, the evidence for multi-segment ruptures, and the updated tsunami modeling. The engineering community has access to these findings and is actively working through their implications. The emergency management community is aware of them and is beginning to factor them into planning revision. The process of official incorporation is underway, even if it is moving at the speed that official processes move. What is also required, and what is perhaps more difficult to achieve through official channels, is a change in how the public understands the Seattle fault. The phrase "the big one in Seattle" has for 20 years primarily evoked the Cascadia subduction zone, a known and famous threat whose magnitude 9 potential has been communicated effectively through a range of public education efforts. The Seattle fault has always been in the background of this communication, acknowledged as a significant hazard but overshadowed in the public imagination by the scale and fame of the Cascadia threat. The new research is asking for a revision of this public mental model, not to diminish the seriousness of the Cascadia threat, but to elevate the seriousness of the Seattle fault threat to a level more commensurate with what the science now describes. The reason this matters for public behavior is that the preparations that are most effective for a Seattle fault earthquake are somewhat different from the preparations most relevant to a Cascadia event. A Cascadia earthquake, coming from the offshore subduction zone, would produce ground shaking across a very wide area, but would not produce near-fault ground motions of the extreme intensity that would be experienced close to the Seattle fault. The tsunami from a Cascadia event would affect the outer coast of Washington and Oregon far more than Puget Sound, while the Seattle fault tsunami would primarily affect Puget Sound communities. The lifeline disruption patterns of the two scenarios are different. The emergency response priorities are different, and the specific vulnerabilities in the built environment that are most likely to cause casualties are somewhat different. A public that is preparing primarily for the Cascadia scenario is not fully prepared for the Seattle fault scenario, even if there is substantial overlap in the general preparedness actions that are relevant to both. The geologist has published her research. The findings have been presented at professional conferences and discussed in the scientific literature and communicated to the agency. Scientists and emergency managers who work on seismic hazard for the Pacific Northwest. The process of official response has begun. The code revisions and the hazard map updates and the infrastructure assessments that are the formal mechanism by which the scientific findings get translated into the built environment. This process will take years. The earthquake will not wait for the process to complete. The 1100-year-old earthquake on the Seattle fault, the one documented in the tsunami deposits and the landslide records and the uplifted terraces of the Puget Sound shoreline, happened to a landscape that contained no city. The people who lived in the region at that time were not urban residents, dependent on a grid and a water system and a highway network, and the 1,000 interconnected systems that define modern life. The shaking they experienced, which the evidence suggests was severe across a wide area, caused harm and disruption of a kind that is invisible in the geological record but real in the experience of any community that encounters a major earthquake. When the Seattle fault moves again, it will move beneath a metropolitan area of nearly 4 million people, beneath a density of critical infrastructure that would not have been imagined by anyone living 1,100 years ago, beneath the hospitals and the bridges and the school buildings and the masonry commercial districts and the soft-story apartment buildings and the waterfront facilities and the fuel storage terminals and the wastewater treatment plants that together constitute the physical substrate of a modern city. The new research has made the picture of what that event could look like more accurate, more detailed, and in important respects, more alarming than the previous picture. It has done this not by manufacturing alarm, but by reading more carefully the evidence that the fault itself has been providing for centuries. The cracks in the parking garage walls, and the scarps in the LiDAR data, and the sand layers in the coastal sediments, and understanding more clearly what that evidence says. What it says is that the Seattle fault is a larger and more capable structure than was previously established, that it has behaved in more complex and potentially more destructive ways in the past than previous models described, and that the city built above it needs to take seriously the full range of what it can do. The scientists are not predicting when the earthquake will come. They cannot. What they are doing, with the new research and with the professional responsibility that motivates the research in the first place, is making sure that when it comes, The people and the infrastructure in its path have been given the most accurate possible understanding of what to prepare for. The fault has been speaking in the language of geology for 1100 years. The new research is a more fluent reading of what it has been saying. Whether the city above it will respond to that reading with the urgency and the investment that the translation demands is the question that the science cannot answer. It is the question that belongs to the people who live there and to the officials they elect, and to the decisions they make together about what kind of city they want to be standing when the ground finally moves. The crack in the parking garage wall is still there. The fault beneath it is still loading.